Welcome to you all from Cafe Scientifique, Silicon Valley, and thank you for coming on this hot day. As you know, we meet here every third Thursday, January through October. Next month, on September 19th, we hope to have Joseph Latone of IBM to talk about quantum computing. But today, we want to please welcome a cardiologist, a flight surgeon, a computer scientist, a medical consultant for TV shows, an author, an entrepreneur, and he's just one person. Amazing. And that's our speaker, Dr. John Sotos. And if you love history and mystery, you have come to the right place, because he's going to talk to us about the mysteries of President Lincoln's health through the eyes of a doctor. Dr. Sotos earned his bachelor's degree in chemistry and another in mathematics from Dartmouth, then master's in artificial intelligence from Stanford. Then he went on and earned an MD from Johns Hopkins, specializing in transplantation cardiology. And he spent over 20 years there. He wrote his first book, Zebra Cards, an aid to obscure diagnostics. The producer of the show, House MD, I saw it, thought that it was an excellent source for arcane diagnostic dilemmas that audience could not possibly solve. But then Dr. House could dazzle the audience by masterfully solving them. They bought the television rights to his book and hired Dr. Sotos for 6 seasons. Since then, Dr. Sotos has consulted for many other shows, such as The Good Doctor and Torchwood. Dr. Sotos is Colonel Sotos, a military flight surgeon for 33 years and currently state air surgeon for California Air National Guard. He is a longtime member of the U.S. Air Force Combat Rescue Service and is a veteran of 2 volunteer deployments with Air Force Special Operations. Working in Silicon Valley for 23 years, he was chief medical engineer at Healthion and WebMD, and chief medical officer at Intel Health and Life Sciences. Today, he's a co-founder and CEO at Expertscape, which quantifies the expertise of individuals and institutions in 27,000 different biomedical topics. So consumers can find knowledgeable physicians for difficult or arcane medical problems. It is free to use at expertscape.com. And he's the author of several books, some of them are here. And you can browse them and even buy them, if you wish, after the talk. So here is Dr. Sotos.
Thank you. Am I good? Thank you, Kay. Thank you for taking a chance on a cardiologist. I know you have mostly engineers here, and thank you for the kind introduction, which I think introductions are usually just to convince the audience the speaker isn't a complete crackpot. And that's maybe more important than usual tonight, because I'm going to talk about a lot of things that may be against the common wisdom that you've heard before. So not a complete crackpot. That's about as best I can do. So my goal is to show tonight that Abraham Lincoln, whom you all know, had a multifaceted genetic disease that literally affected him from the top of his head to the tip of his toes. And that it's not possible to understand the man fully in the way a historian might unless you understand this disease. And that's sort of hopefully it's somewhat obvious, because we all know that our physical bodies can sometimes manifest certain things in psychological ways. In the process of going over this diagnosis, what we'll come to realize, although not here tonight, it's in the books, is that Lincoln was not depressed. He was not stressed about the Civil War to the point that that horrible physical decline he experienced by the end of his life was due to stress. I don't think it was. And then there's also a meme around that Lincoln was homosexually inclined. And then that's briefly discussed in the book as well, that the diagnosis really undermines a lot of the data that led to that hypothesis. So tonight, I'd like to first talk about medical diagnosis in general, then talk about the specific evidence in Lincoln's case, and then talk a little bit about what the diagnosis means. So when you think of medical diagnostics today, especially being in Silicon Valley, you think of machines. Somebody goes, gets in a big machine like this, smart people look at the images, and the diagnosis comes out. Well, that's not the way it was for 3,000 years of medicine. And it really, the other style reached its peak in Edinburgh, Scotland, around the end of the 1800s with that man, Joseph Bell, who was a surgeon. And Bell had unbelievable observational powers and was able to put things together. And one of his students was a guy named Arthur Conan Doyle, who took Joe Bell's ability to observe and synthesize and turned that into the fictional detective Dr. Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock Holmes. And then, of course, Sherlock Holmes was the inspiration for House. And we actually mentioned Dr. Bell favorably in a couple episodes. So to get you in the mood for this older way of medical thinking, I thought I'd try a few audience involvement. I don't know if the lights can be dimmed a little bit. No? That's okay. This is the only slide where that's needed. So anybody call out what you see in this picture besides it's an ear? There's a crease. Somebody said swollen. Somebody said boxer's ear. That's a diagnosis. That's not an observation. Okay? Inflammation is also a diagnosis. I'm sorry. Well, I think it's because of the lighting. It's red. And the important thing to realize is that the redness and the swelling do not involve the earlobe. And from that fact, you can make the diagnosis with high reliability. Because what's in your ear up here that's not in your earlobe? Cartilage. And so this disease is an autoimmune attack on cartilage called relapsing polychondritis. And this is a way that you can make the diagnosis at the bedside. So here's another situation. I won't ask for audience involvement here, but this is a 14-year-old boy who's sitting on your exam table, and here he's just sitting there relaxing, and here he's bearing down like he's going to move his bowels. And you can see all of a sudden his skin changes color. What's going on? Well, imagine he's laying face down on the table, and like a magician, we saw him in half. This is the cross-section. So here's his spinal bone, and here's his spinal cord. This is his lungs, and this is his aorta. And what's happened is he's got a malformation of his arteries, so that there's a tangle of arteries that goes into his spinal cord and a tangle of arteries that goes into his skin in a couple places. And for whatever reason, these tangle of arteries are linked in the skin and they're linked in the spinal cord. Nobody knows why. But when he bears down, the pressure in his lungs goes up, and that just pushes, it squeezes the blood into the spinal cord and into the skin to escape the pressure here. So this is a very important diagnosis, which you can make just by watching, because those arteries in the spinal cord can bleed and cause paralysis. So somebody like this, if you ever saw that, you'd want to get them to the operating room sooner rather than later. So that was just to sort of put you in the mood for thinking about observations and how they can lead to medical diagnoses. So let's talk about Lincoln. So when we talk about Lincoln and his medical history, we get information from several sources. The first is from eyewitnesses. And the eyewitness I really like is his law partner, William Herndon, shown there. Historians don't like him, because Herndon had a tendency to do bogus theorizing. But as an observer, he was really remarkable. And that's all we're going to trust him to do, is observe. We also have a few artifacts like these casts of Lincoln's face and his hand. We have about 130 photographs of Lincoln, but none from his early years because the camera hadn't been practicalized at that point. We don't have any DNA. We've tried to get DNA, but have been unsuccessful to do that. And I can talk more about that if you like. So, all those information sources, what you can do is you can assemble it into a big giant book like a telephone book. Well, if telephone books were still big. And the way it's organized is I just took, for instance, everything that anybody ever said about Lincoln's joints and put them in a section. Anything that anybody ever said about Lincoln's legs, I took that and put it in a section. And this is the way physicians organize the medical record. So this I call a pseudo-medical record. So we're going to apply that medical record to various myths about Lincoln and see where it leads. So here's a common myth. This is from a 1953 children's book, and it shows Lincoln wrestling a local tough named Jack Armstrong. And you can see that Lincoln has very well-muscled shoulders, bulging biceps, a thick neck, a thin waist. And Armstrong looks vaguely Neanderthalish. So that is what I think we all learned in school. But the reality is quite different. Here is Lincoln at the Antietam battlefield. And you can see that he is tall, true. He is thin. In fact, his hips look like they're wider than his shoulders. You can see maybe that his left chest appears to project out a bit. Maybe that was papers he had in there. Maybe it's his ribs, though. And there's a little spot of daylight right in here, which gives emphasis to the wideness of his hips and maybe suggests a crookedness of his spine. So let's talk about his height. He was 6 feet 3.75 inches and said, when I get all the kinks out, I'm 6'4". And, you know, kinks is an interesting word if you think his spine might have been bent. He's the tallest of all the 44 men who've been president. And in his era, the average height was 5'7". So here, you see him standing with several other people at Antietam. This is General George McClellan, and he ran against McClellan for the presidency in 1864. So you can imagine if it were modern times and they were on the debate stage, how difficult it would be to get them so that Lincoln didn't have just an unfair advantage that way. Does anybody know who this is? That's Ward Lamon, who was Lincoln's unofficial bodyguard, and Lamon was 6'5". So they made him sit down so that he wouldn't be the tallest guy. So Herndon had things to say about Lincoln's height that are really insightful. He noticed that sitting down in a chair, Lincoln was not that much taller than ordinary people. Herndon noticed that Lincoln's arms and legs were what gave him his height, and that they were out of proportion to the rest of his body, and that it was only when he stood up that he loomed over other people. So here you can see what Herndon was talking about. Remember, we saw George McClellan. Lincoln was more than a head taller than him. Now they're sitting down. If McClellan straightened up, he might be able to look at Lincoln straight in the eye. And here's Lincoln in the White House in his office. And Herndon made another great observation, which is that if you put a marble on Lincoln's knee, it would roll down his thigh to his hips. And you can see that here. Lincoln's bone from his ankle up to his knee was very long, as was the bone from his knee back to his hip. So that's what you're seeing there. So let's talk about his arms now. How do we know when arms are long? Well, this is Leonardo da Vinci, his famous drawing, and he shows that the height is just about equal to the wingspan. And in the genetics clinic, we do a similar kind of measurement. We measure wingspan and we divide it by height. And when we do that with Lincoln, well, we don't have a picture of him spread equaled. All we have is this. But if you measure A, B, C, D and divide it by his height, you get a ratio of 1.08. In the genetics clinic, anything above 1.05 is considered long arms. So we can say with a fair amount of confidence that Lincoln did have disproportionately long arms. Now let's talk about his general build. Here's another man that was 6'4" tall, John Wayne. And you can see that Lincoln does not look like John Wayne. Wayne has much wider shoulders, and Wayne's waist is about here, and Lincoln's waist looks like it's about up here. And this is another 6'4" man from the genetics clinic. And Lincoln looks more like him, especially in the way the hips are made and the thin shoulders and the smallish head. So we'll see more about him later. So overall then, I think Lincoln was not a Hercules like we saw in that children's book. Herndon described him as spare, bony, and lean. He was thin, wiry, sinewy, and we'll come back to that word, not muscular. Actually, these weren't Herndon, these were other people. But Lincoln was reputed to be a great athlete, so how do we square this lack of muscles and this thinness with Lincoln's athletic prowess? Well, Lincoln told Herndon exactly how. Lincoln could throw a cannonball further than anyone else in the village of New Salem where he lived. Lincoln did not attribute this to a greater proportion of physical strength, but said that the length of his arms gave him a greater swing and therefore acquired more force and momentum than the hands of an average man. So Lincoln had a biomechanical advantage and he knew how to use it. So the data that we've talked about so far in 1962 led a doctor in Kentucky to theorize that Lincoln had a specific genetic disease called Marfan syndrome. And this is really a wonderful paper. Gordon was very observant, very smart. So Marfan syndrome affects the skeleton, the heart, the arteries, the eyes, and of course, being a genetic disorder, other members of the family. It wasn't known by medical science until 30 years after Lincoln died. It was discovered in Paris in 1896. Here's our man from the genetics clinic. He's got Marfan syndrome. And here's a child with really quite striking manifestations of the skeletal features of Marfan syndrome, extremely long limbs, both the legs and the arms, and thinness of the limbs as well. So if you're going to diagnose Marfan syndrome, today you do it with a DNA test. We don't have that luxury. But before DNA testing came out, people made essentially a checklist of various features and just went down to see which one of those the patient had. So we can do this for Lincoln. And we've already seen that his legs and arms were like those of a Marfan patient. The ribs, I mentioned only briefly, but people with Marfan syndrome have long bones that grow too long. And so the ribs are long bones too. And when they grow too long, they actually curl in and they push the sternum back, giving a sunken chest. And Herndon tells us quite specifically that Lincoln had a sunken chest. So I'm not going to talk about the effects of Marfan syndrome on the skull. That's in the book. And I'm not going to talk about the hands either. But I do want to talk about the feet because that's actually the most interesting part of Lincoln's skeleton. So in Marfan syndrome, people have long, thin feet. Lincoln wore a size 12B shoe in today's units. He also had flat feet. Marfan patients have that, and Herndon tells us that Lincoln had flat feet. But it's the toes that are quite interesting. So this is a patient with Marfan syndrome, and you can see that his big toe, which is a long bone, is quite overgrown compared to the other short bones in his feet. So we don't have pictures of Lincoln's feet, but we do have pictures of his shoes when he's wearing them. And you can see right here that he's got a pucker in his boot. This is where his big toe is, but where his little toes are, the fabric or the material is pressed in, suggesting his toes don't come all the way out. And it's not just one picture. You can see it again here, and you can see it again quite clearly here. So boot makers who examine Lincoln's boots, which survive, tell me that the pucker is really quite easily visible in real life, even today. Well, how does that square with Lincoln? Okay, he might have had this, but is there any more information we can gather? Yes, there is. In Lincoln's time, there weren't really news photographers. That was just starting. But what would happen is when a major news event happened, the magazines and the newspapers would send an artist out to the scene of the event, and the artist would talk to witnesses and draw what the witnesses told him. That's exactly what happened when Lincoln was shot. So Frank Leslie's newspaper sent an artist to the Peterson house where Lincoln died, and they talked to an observer, and this is what the observer said Lincoln looked like laying on his deathbed. So you can see that Lincoln had exactly the toes that you would expect in a Marfan patient. So I'm going to give Lincoln a chuck on his feet. All right, now let's talk about flexibility. Marfan patients have flexible joints. They can do things with their fingers and limbs that you probably can't. Let's look at Lincoln. So here's Lincoln at age 37, sitting in a relaxed pose. And you can see his left hand is just sitting on his knee. And what have we got here when we zoom in on his hand? Well, you can see the fingernails from his first 2 fingers, and then his 3rd finger, his ring finger, comes here, and then there's this little bit of white right here, which is his fingernail of his ring finger. And I don't know about you, but I find it very difficult to get my finger in that position. And I really have to work at it. Lincoln, however, just by putting his fingers on his knee, made that happen. This suggests that the joints in his hand were loose. But there's more. Daniel Berner lived with Lincoln when they were in their 20s. And Berner remembered many years later that Lincoln was full of pranks that showed his agility. Lincoln would place a cup of water between his heels on the floor, and then folding his arms, bend backwards until he could grip the lip of the cup in his mouth, and then straighten himself up without spilling the water. And so you read that and you go, that's crazy. Well, there's a second source. So Lincoln's first cousin, Sophie Hanks, moved to Arkansas. And in 1910, a reporter from the Atlantic magazine went down there and talked to Sophie's son, a physician named James LeGrand. And LeGrand said, I've heard Mother say many times that Abe would stand flat on his feet and lean back his head until it would touch the floor. So these are 2 witnesses separated by 500 miles. And in fact, LeGrand was so impressed with this as a boy that he used to practice it himself, but he could never quite get it right. So you still may say, well, this is just impossible. But as always, the internet comes to the rescue. And so if you look for a video called Solid Potato Salad from 1944, you can see this woman bending backwards to the point she could pick up a cup from the floor. But actually, it's more than that. So I don't think there's really any question that Lincoln had the kind of flexibility that this woman does. So we'll give Lincoln a check plus on joint flexibility. So what we can do now is we can collapse all these subparts of the skeleton down into one and just give Lincoln a check mark on the skeleton. Next, we would examine the heart, arteries, and eyes, but we're not going to do that here because we've only got so much time. But suffice it to say, he did not have any of the heart conditions, artery conditions, or eye conditions that are normally and that you expect to see in Marfan syndrome. I'm also going to not talk about his family now, but we'll come back to it. But for right now, he's sort of a plus minus for Marfan and family. So when you take all this together, the absence of the heart, artery, and eye really tells you that Lincoln did not have Marfan syndrome. But what he did have was something different, an adjective that we use in medicine called Marfanoid. His skeleton was shaped like that of a Marfan patient, and that's where the word Marfanoid comes from. So that's why the green check is there, because Lincoln was Marfanoid. So it turns out that Marfan syndrome is not the only cause of a Marfanoid skeleton. There are like 24 different things. And this is a list of some of them, some of the other medical conditions that cause a Marfanoid skeleton. And these are very rare things. This is very exotic stuff. Most physicians will see Marfan syndrome in their professional career, but really all these others, no, they're so rare. Now, the way these are distinguished from each other is by other features. We talked about how Marfan has heart and eye involvement. People with homocystinuria tend to be mentally retarded. Lincoln obviously wasn't. People with Beal syndrome have characteristic crumpled ears. Lincoln really didn't. People with Sprintzen-Goldberg have misshapen heads. Loeys-Dietz syndrome, you have a forked uvula, which is that thing that hangs down in the back of your mouth. And in MEN2B, which we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about, you get these oddities with your lips. So we can then make a checklist for these other conditions, just like we did for Marfan, and we're going to compare them with Lincoln. And as I previewed already, you know, he did not have Marfan, Beals, or Loeys-Dietz. So we're going to try and resolve these question marks to see if he had MEN2B. So what is MEN2B? It's a cancer syndrome. It's got a long name. It was first discovered in 1965. The gene was discovered in 1996. It's really rare. There's maybe 1 person in 1 million that has it. There's no large studies of MEN2B because there just aren't enough patients. And so a lot of things about the condition are not well understood by medicine. It's a very serious condition. 100% of people with this condition get cancer of the thyroid gland. 50% of people get cancer of the adrenal gland, and without treatment, life is short, like your 30s. So here's the canonical picture of a patient with MEN2B. She has an unusual facial appearance, which we'll describe, but she is Marfanoid, although that's not here. She has large lips. She has, although not well shown in the picture, she has bumps on her lips. She also has them inside her mouth, on her cheek and on her tongue. She has what is described in medicine as a coarse facial features. She's constipated, and she passed her condition on to about 50% of her children. That's all consistent with MEN2B, which they did lab tests to confirm. She's also got some other features of MEN2B. She has a long, thin neck. She's got dark, bushy eyebrows. She's got sagging of eyelids. Her ears stick out. She's got a chin that is asymmetric, and she's got a little bump right here on her eyelid, which the examiner's finger is actually pointing at. So that's the face of MEN2B. So we're going to take these features like lips, constipation, cancer, and family and apply them to Lincoln. So let's first start with lips. Here's another patient with MEN2B, not quite the very impressive lips that this woman has. This is a more sedate kind of pair of lips. And you can see that Lincoln definitely had a big lower lip. His upper lip, not so much. So the next feature is masses on the lips. And here you can see this person has 3, maybe 4. So we're going to show pictures of Lincoln that span 7 years and show that he had masses in his lips as well. So this mass on his lower right lip from 1858 is present all the way up to the year he died. There's also a mass right here, not especially well seen, and then there's something else going on here. Here's 2 years later. You can see that mass on his lower right lip. The other mass, this guy here, is this guy here. 1863, 1864, 1865, still there. So that's 7 years at least. Here's a different modality. Those were pictures. In 1860, a sculptor made a cast of Lincoln's face. And you can see there's a lump right there. Here's a cast 5 years later. This is a life mask. A lot of people think Lincoln was dead when this was made, but he was alive. And now you can see this mass is really quite prominent, most likely because Lincoln was losing weight, and that sort of reduced the tissue around the mass, making it more prominent. So add all this together, and except for the thin upper lip, I think you have to give Lincoln credit for having all the features of lips in MEN2B. Now let's move on to tonight's signal discussion topic, which is constipation. And I know you came here wanting to hear about that. But Lincoln was constipated, and it was a topic of discussion in the Springfield, Illinois legal community. So his law partner, John Stewart, wrote, Lincoln was a vegetable. He was sluggish, apathetic, and had no natural evacuation of his bowels. Stewart, in fact, advised Lincoln to take a medicine called blue mass, which is a mercury compound. And Lincoln did take it shortly before he went to Washington and for 5 months while president, but it made him cross. That's actually a known side effect of mercury. So Lincoln quit taking it. Herndon quantifies things for us. Says that Lincoln had an evacuation, a passage, about once a week. And Lincoln's big bodyguard said that when Lincoln had no passages, he always had a sick headache and took blue mass. So there you have it, and we're going to leave it at that. So we're going to give Lincoln a check mark for constipation, and that's not as unimportant as I may have painted it, because constipation is a very prominent and very troubling symptom in MEN2B, and in fact, it's one of the earliest to develop, even in childhood. So let's move on to cancer. And cancer is a problem when we look back from 150 years, because cancer really has no obvious signs and symptoms that we can point to, usually. So we really have to talk about the general problem with cancer, which is weight loss. And that's what we're going to do. So here's Lincoln in 1865, and he just looks terrible. But whatever happened to him happened pretty quickly. Here he is just before he was elected. He looks good. 3.5 years later, he still looks good, but in only 13 months, something happened. Obviously, he lost weight. Now, the Lincoln people say, oh, Lincoln was so stressed, the Civil War got to him. Well, let's look at the events. In this 3.5-year period, we had the election, we had the crisis at Fort Sumter, which Lincoln said was the biggest crisis of his presidency. He had numerous friends killed in action in the war. His son died. His wife had a nervous breakdown after the death of the son. There were terrible disasters militarily at Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and on and on. The generals Lincoln had hired were hapless, and oh, by the way, he got smallpox. So that all happened here. In this 13 months, yes, there were stressors. He had the re-election, which was in doubt. There was still continuing carnage on the battlefield, but the war was really going quite well, and he had competent generals in Grant and Sherman, which took a huge load off him. So I really dispute the idea that something extremely stressful happened in here. And it wasn't just his face where he was losing weight. Here's his wrist in 1862, and maybe his what do you call this thing? Cuff, thank you. Maybe his cuff was just too big, but that still looks to me like a skinny wrist. So when people lose weight in cancer, what happens is first the fat burns off you, and then the body starts to consume its own muscle. And one of the last muscles it leaves before the ultimate end is this muscle up here. And this is called the temporal muscle, and it's very important because it helps you chew your food. And if you tighten your jaw, you can feel that muscle tense. So when that muscle goes, you're at an end stage. And so you can see right here that it looks like there's a bit of a shallow depression in Lincoln's skull. It's actually much better seen in the 1865 life mask. So this is more evidence that Lincoln was losing weight in the way that cancer patients do. So when you tell this to Lincoln people, they go, wait. Lincoln had an autopsy, and there were doctors who saw him naked on the autopsy table, and they said what an incredible physical specimen he was. Okay, so let's talk about that. What they're really talking about is this recollection by Dr. Edward Curtis. So in 1908, 43 years later, he's addressing some New York veterans, and he describes seeing Lincoln with a smooth, clear skin fitting cleanly over well-rounded muscles, sinewy and strong, the physique of an athlete in training. And then 5 years earlier, he had written in a newspaper, I was simply astonished at the showing of the nude remains, where well-rounded muscles built upon strong bones told the powerful athlete. Well, that's pretty hard to square with reality. Remember, Lincoln was 6'4". He weighed, even at his peak physical condition, less than 180 pounds. So I'm 6 feet tall, I weigh 170 pounds, and nobody has ever accused me of being well-muscled. So, you add on top of this that the body consumes the limb muscles before it consumes this muscle, so you got to wonder, how could he be so muscular and yet have these things going on? Well, let's look at Dr. Curtis's statement again. In 1865, he wrote a long letter to his mother right after the autopsy, and he doesn't mention Lincoln's physique at all. But in this 1903 newspaper article, he starts to wax eloquent about this weird theory that those who achieve greatness by reason of intellectual and moral force are more often than not men of well-developed, powerful physique. And he cites Lincoln as an example of this. So Curtis may not have been neutral, in other words. He had this theory, and he wanted to use Lincoln to prove it. And then if you parse his words, you still end up with doubts. What does skin fitting cleanly mean? What does well-rounded muscles, sinewy, strong mean? And remember, sinewy is a word that was common back then, but it really means a long, stringy muscle. Today we use it mostly to describe tendons and that sort of thing. So sinewy is not an Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of bicep. And then he talks about seeing strong bones. I don't know how you look at somebody and tell their bones are strong, but okay. So this is what I think Curtis was seeing, and I apologize if this picture is a little disturbing, but this is a man with absolutely no body fat living in Vancouver, Canada. And you can see that his muscles are incredibly well defined. They're not all that big. And this, this down here looks like a strong bone. So I think the comments about the bones and the muscles are really a way of just saying that there was almost no body fat on Lincoln. And in fact, one of the other doctors at the autopsy said there was not a grain of fat on the body. So here's more about that word sinewy. Anatomy textbooks like people with no body fat because it shows muscles and other anatomical structures so well. So that's the case for Lincoln losing weight. Now let's talk about maybe what type of cancer he did have. So possibility number one, the two main cancers in MEN2B is the thyroid gland. And it has one distinguishing symptom, is that people can't tolerate alcohol. It gives them terrible flushing, terrible diarrhea. It's miserable. Lincoln, in his youth, did drink, but as an adult, he did not. That's a squishy data point, but it is interesting to note. This type of cancer usually presents with a neck mass, but the pictures of Lincoln just don't show his neck after he gets to Washington. It's really just the systemic cancer effects like the weight loss we've been talking about that we could appeal to. What about the second type of cancer, the adrenal gland cancer? This one, shorthand is called a Pheo, is a very interesting syndrome because it does cause specific symptoms. It causes headaches, fainting, sweating, nausea, and cold hands and feet. And it does this because the adrenal tumor is producing adrenaline. And so if you go and look at Lincoln in the last 4 months of his life, he had all of these, except the one day he was really sweating. It was really hot out. So I'll give him a pass on that. But these features were present in an abnormal way. So, for instance, here's Lincoln again in Antietam, and there's a very subtle sign here, potentially, of a Pheo, which is that he's wearing gloves. And this is October in Maryland. It's not freezing cold in October in Maryland. And in fact, McClellan looks like he's quite sunburnished at this point in time. So here's another option. Oh, and the reason that the gloves are a symptom or sign perhaps of Pheo is when that adrenaline pumps out, the vessels in your body clamp down, and that makes your hands cold. It's like sticking your hands in ice. It makes the vessels clamp down. So here's a friend of Lincoln's, Joshua Speed, seeing Lincoln a few weeks before his death. Speed goes into the office and watches two women very emotionally pleading with Lincoln to do something, and then they leave. And Speed says, "We were then alone. Lincoln drew his chair to the fire and said, 'Speed, I am a little alarmed about myself. Just feel my hand.' The hand was cold and clammy. Lincoln then pulled off his boots and put his feet to the fire, so close that the heat made them steam. So Lincoln really had cold feet. Speed said overwork was producing nervousness. And Lincoln disagreed, said, 'No, I am not tired. The scene you just witnessed,' Speed said, that I just witnessed, is enough to make you nervous. But Lincoln said, 'No, Speed, you are wrong. I have made two people happy today.' In other words, Lincoln was not nervous, upset, stressed by the two women that had just been to see him. And yet, his hands and feet were incredibly cold. So, add all this together, and I think we'll give Lincoln sort of a plus-minus on the cancer. We're not ruling out that he had cancer, and that's about as good as we can do. So let's now talk about his family. Here's Lincoln's immediate family tree, and we can rule out some of the people from having MEN2B. Without treatment, people don't live to age 73, like his father did, and they don't live to age 82, like Lincoln's oldest son did. Lincoln's sister was short and stocky. That's the wrong body type for MEN2B. She may have had it, but I think the odds are low. Lincoln had a younger brother who lived only a couple days, and we'll never know anything about him. So we're going to talk about his mother, who died at the age of 34, and his 3 sons, who all died young. So there are no photographs of Lincoln's mother, but she was tall. She was 5'10", and that was in the top 0.5% for her era. The descriptions of her, do they sound familiar? Bony, angular, lean, thin, long arms. The ears were very large and stood out from the head. The mouth was large and nose quite prominent. The cheekbones were high. The chin was prominent. A long, stringy neck with that same sunken chest. You know, it actually sounds a fair amount like this woman, and this may be the closest we can get today to a picture of Lincoln's mother. Herndon Lamon, Lincoln's bodyguard, said, tenderly bred, Lincoln's mother might have been beautiful, but hard labor and hard usage bent her handsome form and imparted an unnatural coarseness to her features long before her death. And again, there's that word coarseness, which Lamon is using in the 1800s, but that's exactly the word medical people use to describe the face in MEN2B. Give a fair amount of suspicion that Lincoln's mother had the disorder. Now let's talk about his children. So here's Tad, the youngest. Tad died at age 18. He died of a wasting illness. He was losing weight, like cancer does. He had fluid in his chest. It was not in his lungs, it was in his chest. And that is exactly what you see in medullary thyroid cancer. One of the two top places the cancer here spreads is down into your chest, and it causes the membranes around your lung to start leaking fluid. So I think that's ultimately what killed Tad, this malignant effusion. Now, the interesting thing about Tad is when you zoom in on his lips, he's got bumps on his lips. You can see a bump here and a bump there, and then at a separate point in time he's got them. You can sort of see it here. He's got two very prominent bumps down here. And he was an unusual looking person. His ears stuck out, he's got not much of a chin, and his lips are a little odd there in that picture. So then there's Willie. Willie died at age 11 from typhoid fever. He was never a robust boy. He had had scarlet fever and measles early in life. He too had bumps. Here you can see a bump which is present again at a separate time. Here's a larger bump, here's a larger bump. Willie also had that high waist. This is a drawing of what the normal proportions in an 8-year-old or a 13-year-old boy should be. And you could see that, like his father, Lincoln had a high waist with a smaller trunk than children of his age normally have. If anybody's a Lincoln collector and has a better copy of this picture, I'd love to get a copy of it. But if you take this picture of Willie and push Photoshop to its limits, you can see that he had a large lower lip, and you get a sense, not well seen here, but better on the computer screen, that his upper lip was thick as well. So here's Eddie. Eddie died before the age of 4 after a 2-month wasting illness, and age 4 is not too early to die from this disease. There have been babies who have been born with cancer and who die before the age of 1. So we know very little about Eddie, except that he was taller than his brother Robert. And this is the only picture of Eddie, and he's got an asymmetric lip in the lower lip with what looks like a mass right there. As a control, here's Robert, the oldest son, who lived to 82, and he's got smooth lips without lumps. So I think you have to, again, suspect that the children had the same sort of thing that Lincoln did and that his mother did. And for me, this is really what sealed the deal as far as confidence in the diagnosis. So we're going to give a check plus on the family, and when you add up all this together, nothing in medicine is ever absolute, nothing ever lines up as perfectly as you want it to do. But for me, this is enough to say, absent a DNA test, that Lincoln had the disorder MEN2B. There's some other features of the disorders which we're not going to talk about. It affects the muscles, it affects the eye, and that famous mole that Lincoln had on his cheek. It's like the lumps that are in the lip. They sometimes occur on the skin as well. So what you can do with this MEN2B is it becomes what's called a unifying diagnosis. You can take all the known features of the disease, which I put in the rectangles here, and you can line them up with all the features about Abraham Lincoln and his family that people have noticed over the years, and you can map them really quite well. And this too adds confidence to the diagnosis. Now, when I talk to medical people about this, the problem they always raise is that Lincoln lived so long. He was killed at age 56. The survival in MEN2B is not really confidently worked out because there just aren't enough patients, but the impression is people die in their 30s. Thyroid cancer usually appears in the 20s, and the adrenal cancer 5 to 10 years later. Now, even though Lincoln survived to 56, I don't think he would have lived to 57, looking at that last picture of him. So the thing about MEN2B is that there are some people who do better with the disorder than other people. There seems to be a mild version where people do live untreated into their 50s. And the reason is that thyroid cancer can sometimes move very slowly. So for instance, one study looked at 16 people with the thyroid cancer that had already spread outside the thyroid. And they looked 10 years later, and 15 of them were still alive. And medicine really doesn't have good chemotherapy for this type of thyroid cancer. And so this is really quite a striking survival after 10 years. There's even a case of someone who survived 25 years after the cancer had spread to their liver. There's a case of MEN2B of a man who was diagnosed at age 51, and when he died at age 68, the thyroid cancer had not spread out of his gland. So another way to think about this is imagine that MEN2B survival is a bell curve, and the top 2% live longer than the other 98%. Well, if you can do the math on that, and you can say if you're in practice as a doctor and you want a 50% chance of seeing an MEN2B patient in that top 2%, you have to see 34 patients. There are probably 3 doctors in the entire country who have seen this many MEN2B patients. And to have a 90% chance of seeing a patient in that top 2% of survival, you'd have to see 110 patients. So when you go by physician experience in this disorder, you have to be very you have to be very careful. So another question that's fair to ask is, why did this disorder take so long to be recognized in Lincoln? Even if it's not the right diagnosis, I think you'll agree it's still a pretty good story. And so why did nobody else put this together? Well, it's probably due to the way labor is split up in science. So geneticists are interested in Lincoln. We had a genetics lecturer in my medical school tell us about Lincoln. So they're interested, but they're not interested in MEN2B. They don't think about it because MEN2B goes to the oncologists. The oncologists don't think about Lincoln. And as for the psychiatrists and historians, they never think about medicine at all. Well, excuse me, the historians never think about medicine. The psychiatrists think about a narrow subset of medicine. Are you a psychiatrist? Oh, okay. So the other aspect is there's really no substitute for exhaustive research. A lot of the Lincoln material wasn't put together in reasonably accessible format until pretty recently. And the other factor is that medical textbooks can be misleading. I saw this picture when I was an intern, the year after medical school. And, I never forgot her because she is so sad looking. But this is the way I thought everybody with MEN2B looked. And, I had my lecture about Lincoln, and I knew that this was a disorder that made people look like they had Marfan syndrome. But I didn't put it together when I was an intern because he doesn't look like her. And so when medical textbooks show you pictures of things, they always show the picture who have it the worst. And she has the facial features of MEN2B in a very prominent way. And certainly they never show you the lesser degrees of key signs like the lips. So let's now step away from just medical diagnosis and talk a bit about history. The implications of the diagnosis. So my thought is that this really makes Lincoln more awesome than he already was. He didn't just beat the South, he beat cancer too. The assassination, may have had some good points in the sense that if Lincoln was on a downsloping curve because of his quite advanced illness at that time, he might have had a very drawn-out, messy ending, delirious some days, sensible other days, and you can imagine the constitutional crisis that would have erupted, especially because his vice president was a Democrat, not a Republican. So the assassination, may have avoided a constitutional crisis. It also suggests to us that our understanding of the man is incomplete and sometimes wrong. So features of MEN2B can simulate other disorders. Like the woman who I remembered being an intern when I was an intern as being so sad, that is a feature of the disorder because, as I briefly mentioned, it affects the muscles. And the muscles in people with MEN2B sag in the face, like that woman does. And so when you looked at Lincoln, and he was just abstracted, deep in thought, the muscles in his face would sag, and he would appear sad. And this led to a whole bunch of pop science, or pop medicine, that labeled the diagnosis of depression on him, and I really don't think there's a chance in the world that he had it. And the book goes through this at some length. The other interesting thing to think about is how somebody's body image, when they're growing up, can impact the development of their personality. And we all know that Lincoln had this amazing personality, sort of unique in American politics. And so let's take a little time to talk about that. The first thing I remember hearing about Lincoln when I was in second grade is that he was ugly. And of course, doctors don't use that word. They use a word that's a little different. It means it's dysmorphic, and that means abnormally formed. So, humans have this tendency to perceive any deviation from the average as ugliness. So really, dysmorphism, a deviation from the normal formation, is encapsulated in this word. Today, Lincoln's face is so familiar that we really can't see him with fresh eyes. And so I don't think we really perceive him as ugly, just as Lincoln. So the big telephone book collects all the times that people called Lincoln ugly that I ran across in my reading. And, it's not just a half a page of people calling him ugly. It's not 1.5 pages. It's not 2.5 pages. It's not 3.5 pages. It's 4 pages of people calling Abraham Lincoln ugly. And it started young. So his boyfriend friend, Alexander Simpson, remembered Lincoln was the shyest, most reticent, most uncouth and awkward appearing, homeliest and worst dressed boy in the area. A woman in New Salem called him thin as a beanpole and ugly as a scarecrow. She was the right age for him to be courting her, which, he wouldn't have had a chance. And not just a little bit ugly. This man called Lincoln the homeliest man I had ever seen. This reverend called him the ugliest man I had ever seen. A journalist, the homeliest man I ever saw. Here's a Southerner calling him the ugliest white man I have ever seen. And then here's Nathaniel Hawthorne, giving him a break, about the homeliest man I ever saw, but not repulsive. So Lincoln went up to speak at his son's high school graduation at the Exeter Academy. And it's recorded that the other students were whispering, isn't it too bad that Bob's father is so homely? Don't you feel sorry for him? But if you really want the heart of the matter, you have to go to teenage girls. So here's Polly Richardson. And yes, I was Abe's first sweetheart. He was mighty good, and I never found any fault with him except he was so tall and awkward. All the young girls my age made fun of Abe. They'd laugh at him right before his face, but Abe never appeared to care. He was so good, and he'd just laugh with them. Abe tried to go with some of them, but no siree, they'd give him the mitten every time, just because he was so tall and gawky. And it was mighty awkward, I can tell you, trying to keep company with a fellow as tall as Lincoln. But Abe was still so good and kind, and I never sacked him. I'd sometimes get right put out the way some of the girls treated him, laughing and saying things. And so when we'd get off to ourselves, I'd give them a piece of my mind about it, and they'd say all that. It's too bad the way we do it, because Abe's so good, but they'd appear to forget about it. For the very next time, they'd do it the same way. Abe wanted me to marry him, but I refused. I suppose if I had known he was to be president someday, I'd have took him. There are other girls, awkward, large feet, so quiet and awful homely, unmercifully teased by, one girl was unmercifully teased by her friends because Lincoln was courting her, and even Lincoln's wife called him not pretty. So what did Lincoln think about all this? John Nicholey was Lincoln's secretary, worked with him every day throughout the entire war. And Nicholey thought it is doubtful that Lincoln was as indifferent to his personal appearance as we have been led to suppose. There were too many passing references in his speeches and in conversation to warrant the belief he gave it no thought. He told John Hay, the other secretary, of his dream in which a party of plain people comment on his appearance. So Lincoln is even dreaming about how ugly he is, saying he was a very common-looking man, to which in the dream, Lincoln replied, "The Lord prefers common-looking people. That is the reason he makes so many of them." His shuddering comment on a portrait of himself was that it was horribly like. So, a lot to think about, and I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.